Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here today with Dr. John West. Dr. John West has just recently written a book called Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, Why American Christian Leaders Are Failing. And what we're seeing is, and throughout this culture, and we've talked about it a lot on this show, is that Christian leaders sometimes are siding with secular elites on issues like science, race, religious liberty. And it has contributed to the failure of American culture over the many years now, for a while. So Dr. West, he's the vice president and senior fellow at the Seattle-based Discovery Institute. He has written or edited 12 books, done some documentary films. But we're here to talk about his latest book, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. So Dr. West, welcome to Uncommon Sense. I appreciate you being on the show today.
Peter, thanks for having me.
So Stockholm Syndrome is like when you're taken hostage, you start feeling sympathy to your hostage takers and almost seem to kind of relate more to them than the people that you were there. So when you add the word Christianity to it, really makes it like, who's holding Christians hostage? How are we feeling this? Like, explain to me how the title works in relation to everything that's here.
Sure. So, I wrote the book because I kept seeing how many leading Christians in politics, academia, where I spent over 12 years, the media, culturally sensitive, influential situations were looking more like the world than their fellow Christians or the historic teachings of Christianity. And so in trying to understand this, I thought, really, the Stockholm Syndrome is a way of understanding people certainly I knew personally. So if you are in, say, the media or politics or academia and you're a Christian, you've probably spent most of your life going through institutions, studying under people, having peer groups that are largely hostile to your Christian faith. And so you're really held captive by the culture, whether it be in graduate school where you're studying under people who don't believe the Bible is true, don't believe the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then after years of that and interacting with those fellow people and learning from them, I think it can be quite understandable that some of these Christians end up adopting the point of view, the worldview of the people around them. And so they're actually more like the anti-Christian elites around them than their historic faith. And so it's not just a case of people getting cowardly or being fearful or trying to get ahead, say. I think there is some of that, but some of these Christian leaders actually believe what they're saying, or they sincerely believe it, but they've adopted it from these anti-Christian elites around them.
So is it possible, though, that some of these leaders, and there are several I've called out in the show, I think the easiest one to call out, in my opinion, is Andy Stanley, who has just gone off the deep end after his father died. He was already kind of teetering until when his father died. He just seemed to like go all in at that point. But is it possible that some of these leaders are more responding to cultural shifts rather than being captured? Like, how do you distinguish the difference between like compromise and just being the context of their situation that they're in?
I guess I'm trying to be charitable, but I do think that there certainly is some compromise and just ceding. On the other hand, when you listen to how they talk about it, and Andy Stanley is a good example, you get, I would say his fall was way before his dad died. So I target in the first chapter of my book, a book that he wrote in 2018, I think it was, that was dealing with the Old Testament and how basically everything that Christians believe about the Old Testament, that's caused them to do all sorts of bad things, and we should basically call the Old Testament the obsolete Testament, and we should move it. Literally, he actually advocates moving in our Bible, reorganizing our Bible so the Old Testament is moved to the back. But he has a very interesting point in one part where he basically says that in today's culture, the Bible basically is not defensible any longer.
Right.
And that it really can't be defended. And I think that begins to show that he really has become embarrassed by the Bible, and that but why is he doing that? Because he's actually adopted the critiques He's actually, maybe subjectively says, well, he still believes the Bible and various things, but really, if you listen to him talk, he's adopted the worldview of the people around him. Now, yeah, I guess you could say he's just trying to curry favor, or he would say he's trying to reach, people who are, unreached. But again, I think if you read through the book, it comes through pretty clearly that he himself has bought into a lot of the critiques, whether he knows it consciously or not.
So we have other like fallen pastors though that at one point in time to raise and to build their churches. Hillsong in New York. For some reason, his name escapes me right now. But Mark Driscoll from kind of where you're from in the Seattle area. He started out just kind of going to coffee shops and bringing people around. Now, and we can have a separate conversation about like what happened to them at the end and some of the problems, but we can't ignore the fact that they were building churches, that for the most part, they were going after people who would have nothing to do with the Christian faith at all. Again, do they fall under this category when they're engaging with them where they're at? Or again, is it after they're already there, after they already got their church, when they're like, hey, I want to keep my membership, or hey, I truly believe it? Where do you, there has to be some distinction between being in the world and not of the world.
No, I do think that's the case. And in some of the cases you've brought up, I think it's just, people end up being corrupted and they end up falling away from the faith for a variety of reasons. But what I'm talking about, and the specific examples that I use, I think I can justify this, are because I've also known people like this. They're actually sincere, but they end up aping the talking points of the secularists around them. So some of them may say, so like let's take from the Presbyterian tradition, Tim Keller, beloved figure. I think he did a lot of good. I think he was a sincere Christian to the very end. However, if you look in the last 10 years of his life, when he went out to give public pronouncements, more and more of those pronouncements were really tracking with talking points of people who weren't Christians, and really indicting his fellow Christians more than looking around in the culture. And it wasn't all on politically charged things. Let me just give one example from a book that he wrote called Generous Justice, which dealt with poverty issues. Now, there's a lot of good biblical exegesis in that book, but when he gets to solutions, it's pretty much left-wing progressive talking points that all poverty really goes back to structural sins of these corporate entities. Now, do I think institutions can be evil and do bad things? Sure. But what he completely pretty much glosses over is that in the United States, certainly, long-term intergenerational poverty is largely a function of the breakdown of the family. But he doesn't want to go there. Well, why not? I mean, some of it may have been embarrassment, but I think he bought into these, I don't want to call it Marxist because that's too bandied about, but certainly his talk about structural evil and these large, sort of materialistic causes in the structures of society, that's the real cause of all poverty. He's not getting that from the Bible. I mean, he's getting that from the elites that he's read about and that has been influenced by. But then what it leads to is that he then submarines really some of the biblical teaching about the importance of family relationships, the importance of things like that are really important in our society. So I think, Tim Keller is a good example of someone who was personally faithful as a Christian, but his talking points, if you will, and also even on sexuality, where unlike Andy Stanley, he did continue to defend a biblical view of marriage to a point. But when he was asked by reporters, he tried to downplay it because it was like he was embarrassed by it, even though he knew that it was true.
Is it possible, though, in situations like Keller, and again, I'll distinguish Keller from Stanley. I do think, because again, like I said, I think Stanley is just, I don't throw this term loosely, but I don't see a better example of a false prophet than I do Andy Stanley. And you may disagree on that to some level, but I may be a little extreme in my description of him. But Tim Keller, I agree with you, didn't quite go to that far. Is it possible that Tim Keller was like, okay, if I go down this way, then I won't be able to reach unsaved people. So I have to be careful in managing the media and not actually be part of one of the hostages that are in the situation. Or is it one of those things he was on the way and you would have anticipated if he lived another 10, 15 years, he would have completely relented?
I don't know. I think he probably personally would have still stayed faithful. But the problem is, and I'm sure that he did tell himself that, this was helping him, be more effective. But the question is, effective for what? So let me give another example with Tim Keller that most people don't know about. In the about it was in the early 2000s, I think. So there was a whole controversy in New York City because a lot of ethnic churches that were doing great work, some of which actually had been planted by Redeemer Presbyterian, were being driven out from being able to rent school facilities for their churches after hours. So, in Manhattan, if you know anything about it, it's very prohibitively expensive. So it's hard for new churches, especially churches at maybe the lower end of the economic spectrum, to get facilities. And so many of them rented school facilities, just like any other community group. They weren't asking for any special things. Well, the board of the education tried to shut that down and try to kick out these churches. That was a gross assault on religious liberty. They weren't being treated equally. Well, who was the most important Christian voice in New York City at the time? And who was the most important Christian voice that basically was mum and basically was silent on it, even though it involved churches that his church had helped plant and some pastors who he had helped mentor? It was Tim Keller. And in fact, some of the pastors who were mentored by him really voiced objections. Now, eventually, people so pointed out that he was being absent without leave, not doing anything on this, that he grudgingly gave a statement eventually. I think it was after the Christian Post published a really stinging article that he finally said something sort of too little too late. But the fact that they ultimately did get to their facilities and that the government relented was no thanks to Tim Keller. And so this wasn't even dealing with sexuality. He wasn't willing to stand up for the religious liberty of his own ethnic brothers in Christ in his own city, that, he said that he was trying to help, enable them. And so I like I said, I think that there's a whole constellation of things that Tim Keller pulled his punches on and basically mimicked talking. Or one other thing, when it came to religious liberty near the end of his life, he gave an interview where he said that he admitted that within 10 years, that probably if you're a Christian and you had a Christian view of sexuality, you might not be able to work for a large corporation. You might not be able to hold a job at an academic, university. But his explanation for that was to blame the Christians, because Christians weren't sufficiently loving of Democrats or gays. Now, far be it from me, there have been Christians who have been said over-the-top things about both gays and about Democrats. So I don't, I'm not dissing that. However, to blame that as the explanation is ludicrous. I mean, if you look at most of the Christians, faithful Christians, right, have not demonized gays. They have not demonized Democrats. And so to blame that for their persecution is really rich and really sad.
That absolutely. I'm shocked when people within the Christian community, within the church, attacks members of the church and not recognize that those extremes that speak out that in such a fashion that you reference, that they are extremes, that they really don't represent Christ, that Christians we represent Christ. And when we act in such a fashion, we aren't doing so. And therefore it calls into question whether we're a Christian or not. And I'm always amazed that Christian leaders ignore that. So moving on to that, because in your book, a big portion of your book, the first 6 chapters of your book, you're dealing with the symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. But the problem is that I see with symptoms of something, especially of Stockholm Syndrome, is you don't know you have the symptom. So okay, so let's say I have it. Let's say I'm one of those people that have it, but I'd have no clue. We were having this conversation about Tim Keller. I bet if you had had this conversation with Tim Keller, he'd be like, "No, I don't have it." There's so many others that don't really think they do because that's the nature of Stockholm Syndrome. So, how does one recognize these symptoms externally, and how does one recognize it internally?
These are great questions. I'd actually highlight a resource on the book's website at stockholmsyndromechristianity.com. I actually have some surveys. You don't have to give any information about yourself. They're anonymous, where sort of there are assessments of, is my church a Stockholm Syndrome Christianity church? Am I, or is a friend of mine? And so, some of the questions are, when you talk about the things where it costs something today for a Christian to believe, like a biblical view of marriage, like a robust view of religious liberty for Christians, like a view of on pro-life and some other issues, are you actually feeding yourself and listening to sources on those things and equipping yourself, or are you not? That's one question. Where are you getting your information from the world? Is it from shows like yours or others, or are you really simply imbibing information from TikTok, the New York Times, Washington Post, the places that actually largely the reporters are hostile to Orthodox Christianity, and so you're going to be getting a very skewed view of the world. Because in my experience, actually, one of the biggest predictors of Stockholm Syndrome Christianity is, where do you get your information from the world, and who do you try to please? And I have a number of chapters on that for sort of going through that. If you're in my experience, for friends or friends' children, if I ask the question, well, where are you getting your information about the world? If they're getting from certain secular sources that, and not all secular sources are bad, but they're getting it from certain sources that where people are fundamentally hostile to Christianity, within a couple of years or something, that's going to have an impact, because that's how you're learning about the real world. And so maybe privately you still think, well, the Bible does teach X, and so I need to hold to that. But if you're imbibing sources that are constantly telling you, well, that's not realistic, that's not the way the world really is, at best, you're going to be torn up between your biblical faith and what you now think the real world shows. And at worst, you're just going to go over and say, well, the Bible isn't really realistic in that, and so we need to go with what the facts actually say. And so I do think asking about your information sources, where you get information, are you reading information that actually helps you to go deeper into biblical truth, or that turns you away from that? So those are some of the things you can ask yourself. But I do want to be sort of blunt here, that the purpose of my book is not to persuade people, if they are Stockholm Syndrome Christians, my book is not going to persuade them to go back. It's really to alert the people who are troubled that something isn't right, and to better understand where it's coming from and what it is, and then what they can do about it. And so really, the focus of my book is to help people who already know that, yeah, there's something isn't quite right, but they don't quite understand where it's coming from, to help them go deeper, to equip them so that when they encounter it, say in their churches or their Christian schools or their Christian universities or their parachurch groups, they understand what's happening and that they are equipped to sort of be voices of truth and light there. And then also, what can you do to protect your own family, to protect yourself, to protect your church, to basically, provide a better example.
So, were you surprised, I guess, based off of kind of when you were reading this, the volume of many evangelical pastors that shut down during COVID? When they were told that the church attendance was not essential. And I want to distinguish between those churches that shut down because we didn't know, like early on when we really didn't know, like we honestly thought, if we don't shut down, we will spread, the diseases everywhere. And then once more information started coming out, there were some that still willfully complied. There was a church down the street from my office who just started opening back up about 6 months ago. There was to me, I interpreted it as a laziness. Do you see that more as the Stockholm Syndrome case, or do you think there's a multiple factors involved in it? And were you surprised by it?
I was actually surprised at how long many churches didn't reopen up, even with limitations. I think actually the COVID crisis is an issue that is mixed, and I don't fault anyone, any Christian. I make this clear in the book, who have a different view of, say, the COVID pandemic than I do. And I certainly know I was part of a church leadership team that when we had to figure out how to reopen, and we did pretty soon, but there were a lot of disagreements. And depending on your assessment of risk, and people were honestly trying to do the best. Now, where I think that it's less defensible and it veers more into the Stockholm Syndrome Christianity is, number one, each month that went on, when churches were facing, in some states like Nevada, for example, particularly onerous restrictions that the government was opening up casinos at the same time as not really allowing churches to open up in the same way. I think the fact that there were so few Christians willing to speak out about that, and there were some notable ones, and who gave it a pass, and more than that, one of the things I focus in my book is, sometimes Christians say, if we just had more Christians in places of leadership in America, in the arts and politics, things would be so much better. I try to point out in my book that we have loads of self-identified Christians throughout every sector of American population. The problem is they tend up being indistinguishable from the secularists when they go into these paths. So it's not that they don't dare, and we sometimes may discuss Francis Collins as a good example of that. But when it comes to COVID, the governor in Nevada who enforced this double standard was not an atheist. He was a devout mass-going Catholic, and touted that what a traditional Catholic he was. And then, in fact, the Supreme Court that ultimately the Supreme Court did the right thing and changed the ruling, but the Supreme Court that actually okayed what happened in Nevada, which is opening casinos, but shutting down churches. That court opinion was made possible by our Chief Justice, Roberts, who is not only, was supposed to be a conservative Republican, a conservative Catholic, devout Catholic, and he enabled that. So, and then, similarly, the other thing I think during COVID, when it comes to the COVID vaccinations, again, I don't begrudge any Christian who felt that it was their duty to, recommend that people get the vaccinations, and that they thought for themselves it was part of their loving their neighbor. What I do think, where it veered over way against what the Bible has some clear things about when Christians disagree on things that you can disagree on. There were a lot of Christians who had very serious ethical and other concerns about the COVID vaxes, and when they decided not to, the level of demonization, and actually, since I mentioned Francis Collins, he was one of the ringleaders. Francis Collins was the most powerful scientist in America as the head of the NIH, and he was well known in evangelical circles as this prominent evangelical Christian because of his testimony. But he helped, he was one of the ringleaders in demonizing Christians who disagreed with them, as basically, in one of the interviews I talk about and cite in my book, he basically, Christians and others who weren't even for vaccine mandates were basically accused of being selfish, not loving their neighbor, and being responsible for the deaths of children. I mean, talk about manipulation. So he actually helped turn love thy neighbor into a partisan club to demonize people. And that's so far from Christianity that it's beyond belief bad. I mean, again, reasonable Christians can disagree about whether or not they should have taken the COVID vax, but the demonization of Christians with serious ethical and other objections on something that the Bible certainly doesn't command that you do was, I think, over the top bad. And I think, and it wasn't just college, and this was also on different sides of the political spectrum. I talk about David French, who was sort of a prominent never-Trumper, but then Robert Jeffress, at key Baptist pro-Trump pastor in Texas, who boasted to the Associated Press that when he had people on his staff that were concerned and wanted, say, a religious liberty exemption for his own staff members, he boasted that he didn't grant any of them. So I do think that some of these people who were so enamored with what the secularist talking points were that they failed in their duty to their fellow Christians.
Again, but a large part of it, and based off of your that you have on your site for the survey, but a large part that I'm hearing too, some of that could be leadership where we were unaware, or just bad leadership. I just made a bad decision on it. Some of it could be almost a type of persecution of it, and which we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, even you go back in World War II, you got the Judenrat, who were the Jews that were, selling out other Jews to the Nazis, for money. So I guess when we're looking at this throughout a historical context, what it appears to me is that it really depends on what their source is and how they believe it. Not necessarily, but then we run into the problem of how do we interpret what their belief is true, and is the word of God inerrant or not? I mean, if they're coming out and saying it's not, and we have to apply this, and we're just taking this one verse out of context. But if it is something like we just strongly disagree with what the meaning of this verse is about how to take care of the poor, but we're still using it from a biblical perspective, you're not saying that's part of being Stockholm Syndrome. You're saying it's only those that completely follow culture to be part of that. Is that correct?
Yeah, or if it doesn't add up. No, obviously, I think there are lots of things that faithful Christians can disagree on, and certainly have over the time. And so with COVID, what I was actually trying to say was where I think it gets challenging to simply say, well, this is just a innocent disagreement, is when you had states where they had a double standard,
right,
where they opened up casinos but had more owners things to churches. Well, you have to be pretty oblivious to, even if it's so serious that, people are going to be dead if we don't shut everything down, well, then you shut everything down. Once you have a standard that's a blatant double standard that basically says casinos are more important than churches, and you're not applying the same standard to them, I would say, Christians who were help enable that and didn't speak out about it, I am less tolerant of, because there really was no credible reason for that. I could understand a Christian saying, well, we believe things are so bad that everything should be shut down. Okay, I could get that. But for Christians who went along in states where they opened up casinos but shut down churches and pretended as if this was some sort of reasonable disagreement, rather than that they were just kowtowing to what the authorities say, then I have less tolerance. But let's actually talk about a specific example, since I already referenced him, Francis Collins. So I take it that Francis Collins sincerely believes in Jesus. But the really sad fact is that if you look at his policies while he was in power at the head of the NIH, they are indistinguishable from the most secularist materialist. So let's say abortion, that Christians from the early church on were against abortion and thought that it was wrong. Francis Collins, on his watch, funded millions of tax dollars to create a nationwide tissue bank at the University of Pittsburgh to harvest aborted baby parts, parts from aborted babies, body parts, up to 42 weeks in gestation. That's at term,
right,
for medical research. He funded research like this one that has been written up, and this is not, I'm not making this up, this is all documented. I document it in my book. It's not research where they basically scalped the scalps of aborted babies and grafted them onto mice. This was the nation's most prominent evangelical Christian scientist did this. And then when it comes to transgender stuff for youth, he spent even more millions of dollars on hospitals and doctors who were giving puberty blockers to kids and were cutting off the breasts of young women. And he declared himself an ally and an advocate. He used those terms of the LGBTQ movement. And the thing is that this was, you could have predicted, because before he was at the NIH, what did he make his mark on? Attacking other Christians who were skeptical of unguided Darwinian evolution,
Right.
and who thought that there was evidence of intelligent design in nature, particularly in biology. So Francis Collins, I accept his personal view. I can't see into his heart, except that he's a brother in Christ. But when you see in each of these areas, he's not getting his public policies from anything like the historic Christian tradition.
I agree, and sadly, he used his Christian influence to push a lot of churches in that direction as well. There's some great articles and books out there on him doing that. We're at a close. I want to ask you to let people know how they can find your book, et cetera. But before we do, I want to there was Eric Metaxas gave an incredible endorsement of your book, and I want to read it real quick so people can hear what Eric had to say about this, and then let you know where they can buy your book and learn more about you as well. But Eric Metaxas said, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity is a monumental achievement. Like Megan Basham's Shepherds for Sale, it will infuriate precisely the right people. Every thinking Christian has an obligation to read it to see exactly how ravenous wolves entered the fold of Christendom with the blithe complicity of many shepherds. John West gives us the names and the gruesome details. Will those guilty repent? That is the question. I think it is just such an incredible statement. I had to read it because it is absolutely correct, and I think I appreciate you not shying away from that. So for people to know more about some of the stories like Tim Keller and many others, how do they find out? Where do they go to get your book and to follow you and to learn more about what you're working on?
Right. So they can go to Amazon to get the book. I think if they would like more information about the book, they should go to StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com, which is the book's website. And they can also go to my own personal website, johngwest.com. And just ending, I want to thank you so much for the interview. But, we talked mostly about the problems and the challenges. Half the chapters, I just want to emphasize to people, if you're distraught by what's happening, half the chapters are to actually help you know how you can be salt and light where you're at. And everyone can be. So this book is designed to give people hope by the end. So I have to indict and sort of lay out what's happening and give some resources on that. But I really do, my passion for writing this book was to show people that there are things they can do, that God calls them to do, and that, to stand for truth in their families, their churches, and their communities.
Well, that's good. That's outstanding because if we don't have a practical tool of how to use the Bible, and we don't have a practical tool of how to be a Christian, then we're nothing more than a political party throwing stones at everybody else. So I do appreciate that. And again, for those out there, I recommend going to StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com. Go through the site, order the book, and we'll go from there. So thank you so much, Dr. West. I really appreciate that and all the other stuff that you're working on.
Thank you, Peter.
All right. Thank you.